Picking back up where we left off yesterday, I think we were around page 309. We just finished putting in that startup class. I think is the last thing what we did. So that's the basic kind of setup there. The next thing we want to do is, now that we've kind of got the framework there, we want to have a page where we can see a list of all the users in the system. Okay. So if you would bring that back up, that project will be on page, again, will be on page 309. And what I'm going to do is create a new controller. In the book here, they're going to call it the admin controller. I'm going to call it the user controller because it's really more what it is. So if you go into controllers, I want to collapse that. Okay, collapse all. That's what I was trying to get to. So controllers, I'm going to add a new controller. I'm going to call it the user controller. Oh. And I'm getting that message.
Yeah. You have too many tabs?
That's probably it.
Did that work here?
Yeah, that's it. Just close all the tabs. So looking at page 310, that's where I'm going to pull the code for this controller. So we have an index method, first of all, which is where we're going to display the list of users. But I also need to have a connection to the user manager. Now I could write all of that code into the index method itself, but it would make the index method pretty messy, and it would lead to a lot of code duplication as we keep going on with this. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to add a property down at the bottom of the file, app user manager, okay, bring in the models folder, and we're going to have user manager, and then a getter for the user manager. Now there's a few steps to get to the user manager. First, we're going to start up at the HTTP context. The HTTP context has to do with the current request that the server is dealing with, right? So you request something by going to a page in your browser, it's working on returning it to you. So the context contains all of that details of the request and the response. Okay. Now on that, there is a method called getOwenContext. In fact, however, there is one little thing here. You'll notice this little arrow on the method. You'll notice it's an extension method. So it's actually not part of the HTTP context itself. It's a method that Owen adds on to that object. So we're going to say get OwenContext and then get user manager. Get user manager is also an extension method, and it looks like I'll have to have a include to get it in there. Let's see. Yeah, so Microsoft, ASP.NET, Identity, Owen. So you'll need those parts to be able to access it. So we start with the context for the request. Every context gets an Owen context associated with it. So we've got the HTTP context, and then associated with that we've got Owen context. Okay, which means that for every time you send a request, we're going to get this new Owen context object. right? And if we look back at what we set up in our startup class, we're saying for every context, for every OWN context, there's going to be a new DB object as well as a new user manager. Okay. So all of that we can get from the OWN context once we have it. So that's the general rule to get anything from OWN. We start with the HTTP context, and then we can get the OWN context from that. From the OWN context is where we can actually get our user manager and such. Okay. So that's the code that you need to use to get your user manager. If I also, for whatever reason, wanted to get the database, well, actually, I'll leave that out. If I want to get the role manager, it's going to be the same kind of thing, and some of the other managers. What I want to do now that I've got that property is go ahead and use it over in the view. I'm going to say var users is equal to user manager dot users. It's also simply a good, we don't necessarily need to do it here, but it's good practice. I can't always just call this user manager property anywhere I want to use it, but it's usually worth the first time you ask for it in a method to go ahead and save it to a variable. What that means is that every time you need to use the user manager then in that method, you're using this variable instead of having to call that whole line of code again. Because remember, every time you reference that property, all that code has to run. So you can save yourself some time if you put it into a variable first. Okay. So that's our basic startup for that index method on the user controller. What I want to do from there is I want to be able to, I want to be able to actually put that into a view. So let's create that index view. So I'm going to right click in index and say add view. Okay. So the model for this, let's see first, using auth example models. I'm going to bring in the models namespace and then tell it that my model is an IEnumerable of app users. Okay. I'm going to grab what's here and then make some changes. So we want a create button. Change that to user list. So a button to create new items. I also need a place to store all of the users. So I'm going to borrow that from the code, but I'm going to make some changes again similar to yesterday. The code that's in the book is using Bootstrap 3. So again, they're using panels, which is not currently available. So I'm going to change that over to cards. So it's going to be card primary, and this is going to be card header. card header, we've got a table. All that needs to be in a card body. So I'm going to wrap the table with card body. Actually, this should be UG. Actually, this would be better as
Wouldn't it be better to use model.any?
it would be. It would be. I want to wait till people are finished typing before making that change, but you're right. So looking at the code that's here, so we've got a card is kind of our outer layer, so that's going to put everything in a card. We've got also the card header, and the whole point of that is they want it to look a little bit like this. So we've got the card header, and then we've also got this part, which is going to be the card body. So inside that card body, they're putting a table. So we have a table with 3 columns, an ID, a name, and an email. Okay, so those are the 3 columns that they're showing there. So you'll see first we've got the table tag. We've got 2 classes, table, table striped. Those are bootstrap classes. What that's going to mean that is every other row is going to be in gray when we have actual records there. Okay. The next thing that we have here is a check to say, hey, are there any records? Because the idea is they want to say if there's no records, if there's no users, then show this message instead. Say no user accounts instead. Okay, so we're adding in, we've got a table row here, we've got a table row here. Here we're using TD because that's data, here we're using TH because that's header information. We're using a call span 3 here to spread that over all 3 of those columns. So that means that's going to occupy all 3 columns instead of just occupying 1 column. You're right, it would be better for you to use the any check here because that is a little bit, can be a little bit cheaper. Depending on how it decides to implement the SQL. So it may still decide to implement that SQL as a count, but that means it doesn't have to. That means it can do a cheaper check like an exists on the SQL side. Okay, so if we don't have any users, we're just going to say no user accounts. If we do have a user, then it's looping through and adding a row for each user, showing their user ID, showing their username, showing their email. Okay. Questions?
I'm getting a syntax error on my model declaration.
What do you mean on this one?
Yeah.
INumeral app user?
Yeah, mine is saying only it's INumeral is a type which is not valid given the context.
Are you sure it's lowercase m for model?
Yes, it is.
Just close it and reopen it, see if it goes away.
Now it is. Right, came back.
Well, let's ignore it for now, and let's just see if we can test it with this. So, when I run the program now, let's see what we see. It may take a little bit of time to load, depending on what your state is. For me, it's having to create the I believe that it's finally creating the database at this point. So it may take some time for it to load through there. Okay, so this is what I get, right? I get no user accounts. I assume all of you will have a different error. You probably have a different error in front of you. Okay. If you have that open, you're looking at that error. It's telling us that we haven't fully created. It's not really able to create the tables it needs to. So one way around that to get it to create the tables we need it to, because you already have a database there and we want to keep it, the easiest way around that is to create another database. Have it create a secondary database. Okay. So if you go to your web config, look at your connection string. What I would do is just add a 2 to the end of your database name. If you save that, run it again, what that should end up doing is creating another database in SQL Server. The upside is that database will have all the tables that we need to add.
Sorry, what did you say?
So the initial catalog, change that to a different name. We'll change it back in a minute, but we're just doing that so that we get a second database. So right now I have auth example. If I were to run this again, I would have auth example and auth example 2. So if you go into that second table, that second database that's created, look at the tables. Taking its sweet time. You should see a bunch of tables that start with ASP.NET. Does anybody not have those tables?
Didn't even create a second database for me.
Okay. So you changed the catalog and it didn't change it.
Right.
Okay.
Take a quick look at it. It's the same error from yesterday.
Connection strings. wouldn't create that. It wouldn't create that database. I'm going to try one thing from up here. So I changed the name of the database there. I wonder what happens if I go into models. Did that now create a second one? That's odd. Because it almost seems like it's ignoring the connection string. Default connection. So whatever I'm setting in the web config, why is it not paying attention to that? That is odd. Okay. Alright, so barring that, I guess another way we can go around this is if you open up the project we created yesterday, that user template project, open that up and run it, go create a user, because what we can do is we can kind of borrow the table structure from that project and bring it over to ours.
So should we take the whatever we changed, connection string, set back normal?
Yeah, set it back to normal on your connection string. Go back to wherever you had. I went back to auth, just auth example. Go back to the regular, but open up the template of the project that we did yesterday. So we're working through chapters 13 and 14 of that textbook. It's attached to the email. So who has created, up at the template project, created a user already? User, show of hands. Hasn't registered the user yet? Okay, so you're still working on it. Brandon?
Yes.
So that's what we're doing. Go ahead and register user on that. That will pause the database that we created. And then we can borrow those functions and get this code.
I'll watch the videos.
This is gets up and running. Just execute the program, and then it creates a registry. That's going to break. So then we're going to kind of steal those. We're going to steal those database names. Yeah.
I created the account, but so database storage should show up here.
Yeah. It's going to be. Oh no, it's going to be under here. So there's the database that it created. So you have all those tables there. So you register there.
Yeah, you're doing the wrong part. You're doing the MS.
This one.
Perspective.
So
Mine was the
your structure. So right. That's your structure. The structure you created.
no.
So once that's created, just go ahead and run it. As an unfiltered
I wish there was an easier way to get these data updates.
You won't have to change anything. Run it, register, enter, that will save. So we're going to figure out the definition for those tables that we need, and roles, users, and subclass. That's how we're going to do this. So then you can post tables. Okay, so I think everybody's registered an account now. What you want to do is go back to your Hands-on Test 7 project that you're working on. And what we want to do in here is we're going to go to your SQL Server Object Explorer. Just a reminder, again, you can get that from View SQL Server Object Explorer. I'm going to open up that window. Up at the top, not under Projects, I'm going to go under the SQL Server tree. In there, I'm going to go into local DB. Now you'll see I have two local DBs, the version 13, which is an older one, or the MS SQL local DB, which is the newer one. That's what I want to go into. So here I'm going to go into that. I'm going to go into databases. You should see something like this. Once you get into local DB, you should see something like ASP.NET User Template Example. Okay, does everybody have that? Okay, so expand that out. You're going to see tables. What you should see in there is all the tables that I have here. So you got the migration history, you've got ASP.NET roles, user claims, user logins, user roles, etc. The ones that we want to save, the ones that we need to add to our database, are all of those ones that start with ASP.NET. Don't copy the migration history. So what I'm going to do, I'm going to pin this Object Explorer on here. I'm going to go to the Solution Explorer and pin that over on the other side. Oh, I'm in the wrong project. I need to be over in the auth example project. So pin this over here. Open up the Solution Explorer, pin that over there. So in, oh, I need to do, I can pull that down. Sync. Pull. Changes. Okay. Stage. Changes. I don't have anything. Put window for details. Forward overwrite local files. Oh. Example. Sorry, I tried to add the database project up on my computer upstairs. And when I did that, looks like I caused a kerfuffle. Okay. Okay, there, problem solved. Now I have the database project there that I wanted to have. So I've got a folder for tables there. What I want to do is just select all the tables over here, the ASP.NET tables, and I'm going to drag those into tables over here. Just by dragging and dropping that, that's actually going to take all of the schema definitions and go ahead and add them in here.
And which project is it that you're doing this on?
So what I'm in is going to be your Hands-on Test 7 project. So you can close the example project that we just used and just go back to this, because that's all we needed to do with the example project.
And only the ASP.NET ones?
Yep. So you're going to have the ASP.NET ones, so you should have those tables now added over here once you get that working. Once they're copied, you can just publish your database, and hopefully you should be able to run again. Your website should run again once you've got those tables in there.
Good. It's not. And this one's my current site.
You're dragging from the wrong place to the wrong place. So it has to be, you can't go from one Visual Studio to another Visual Studio.
So I just close that.
So take this, the thing where you drag is behind it. So take that, either one of these, that's fine. You just need to have them side by side.
Oh, okay.
Because then you drag that
Drag it in the
table.
table.
Did you get that?
Yeah.
Is it running now?
That was running before I did it. Should have the tables now.
Even after publishing? So the web config is here. I wish there was an easy way. I usually just double click the tab, so let's go to tab to make it.
Did you have to bring in the model classes too?
Oh. Okay, if you have, I think that's it. If you have a non-model grading method in your DB context, please remove that. The reason being is because it's not calling, the way it's probably set up, it's not calling the base version of on-model grading. That would be your other way to fix it, either remove it or add it. That's it. So because the identity context does override that on-model grading when that code needs to be there, that code wasn't running. So that was the key problem. So either get rid of that or call base, but really just getting rid of it. That will take care of that.
I'm getting a syntax error in the source file. Looks like it's in a temporary file.
Oh, it's actually because of your semicolon at the end.
Oh.
Why do you change it to the authentication in my website?
You can't. You can't. That's why we're going through all this stuff. So that's an option you get when you create the project. You can't change that after the project's created. So that's why we're setting all this stuff up.
So all these classes I can set up.
Right. All the classes that are mentioned there. we're kind of putting them in a different place. Some of those, just a heads up, so just call them by the name of the classes. So the filter template and look and put a few classes in the same file. Just put one class per file.
So early on, when I was creating my database, creating my models for the database, all these classes had it originally as team ID, team ID one, which I was supposed to make to what I wanted it to be, so it created it from model created.
Right. Okay.
So
So
identity model, identity method.
These
are all
there's one way, there's two ways to back around that. One way is we can fix this.
I know, but you forgot
The other way around it is we just use
You're not doing that.
applications.
Oh,
So
so
let's look at your team. Your team is the thing you're trying to have this for, right?
I'm not thinking actually.
So this is all
Oh, it's the game. Okay. So when we go to your game, so okay. So if you have the form TF, you will specify which column it is. A lot of these things can be done either through Trinity, which is a Fluent API, or through annotations. There are some things that can only be done through the Fluent API. This is one of those things you can do both in one. So just by doing that, that will take care of that problem. So this says form key column is called Fluent ID.
Otherwise, it tries to find whatever it thinks it should be.
Otherwise, yeah, it's guessing.
Okay. I think that's kind of in the home control.
Oh wait, no, it's sorry. Team is ID.
Yeah, you're still not.
And this one, this might be one where we have to do it. Yeah, I think this is one where we have to do it. API. Yeah, there are some of these cases where you may end up where this is the most common. Again, based on that would solve that problem. The problem is these multiple times.
Okay.
First, if you override a method without calling the base class version, problem solved.
Yeah, absolutely.
I thought maybe we can do it through the form key, because that's usually the easier way. But that is not something we do. So, yeah, it is. All right, is everybody operating now? Can everybody get to the user index page? You still need to publish, I believe, this. Yeah, so make sure you publish that. Okay. Yes, so go to your DB contacts. Okay. So you have that on model creating method. It's got nothing in it, you can remove it. The problem is that this implements that, so you're by overriding it there, you're removing the implementation that's in AWD. Yeah, that'll make the error go away. Same thing. So you're overriding the method, which means you're overriding it from the code that's there to not running any code. So here we go. you're running now. That should solve everything. Okay. Okay. So just a refresher on what happened there with what the issue was for a lot of people. So if you're building this DB context, so if earlier in the process, remember you went through the generator to generate your DB context, a lot of times it will generate that on model creating method, which is what we call the Fluent API for kind of configuring your schema. So if we have that, and go back to it, override on model creating. By default, the way it set it up, it didn't call the base classes version of that method, right? So it would have had a signature like this on model creating, and in there would have been some logic to set up your database, but it didn't call the base version of that. The reason being, in DB context itself, there's typically no logic in that DB context, so it doesn't call it. General good rule though, if you're overriding a method, you should always call the parent class. So if we call the parent class, which reason being there, the identity DB context does have logic in it. It does have logic in on model creating. So in order to make that work, we do need to call base on model creating. Otherwise, it was struggling to figure out foreign key and primary key relationships on some of the tables is what happened. Because that's how they defined it instead of defining it through, instead of being able to define it through attributes. So that's what solved the problem, is putting on model creating in there. You can either remove it entirely or call base on model creating as the first thing you do. Okay. Going back,
We
yep.
need to include that.
That's up to you. You can either remove it completely, or if you still have on model creating, then you just add that first method in there.
Okay.
So that first call in there.
Is there a preferred way to do that?
Huh?
Like, is it better to just take it out altogether or do it that way?
Either way. If you have logic in there, a lot of logic that usually generates is usually not all that important from the generator. So sometimes it can be better to just remove it in the first place. But there may be reasons that you need to have logic in here. Okay, so if we run it now, I'm going to go to the user's index page, or user index. You should get something like this. Okay, so we've got a create button, which currently doesn't take us anywhere, and we've got this list of user accounts, but it's all currently empty. Okay. So that puts us down to page 312, okay? A good note on here, we kind of can look at the call out here. It says resetting the database. When you start the application, navigate to the user index URL. Take a few moments before the content's rendered and displayed. This because it's creating the database. Code first uses the classes that we created to create that schema, and then you can see the effect of that when you open up Object Explorer, which we did, and we see that there's the ASP.NET users, roles, etc. You can go through and delete the database through there as well. Obviously, I wouldn't recommend that, but you can do that. And then it also allows you to go through there and add a new item. But what we want to look at next is really creating users. Okay, so when we're working with users, typically we don't want to use, it's very rare that we want to use the entire user model object when we're doing so. So anytime we're registering users, logging users in, etc., changing passwords, we're typically going to have a view model to do that. Make sense? So usually we call that class user models, or sorry, that user view models or user models is the name of that file. So I'm going to say add, to the models folder, I'm going to add a new class, I'm going to call it user models, or user view models. So new class, user view models. So I'm going to strip the class out of there. So typically what happens is we'll put all of these models that we're working with the user all in the same file to kind of group them together, even though they're separate classes. Okay? So what I did first there, strip out the class, just because I want to make sure that I'm not putting classes inside of classes for this particular thing. So I'm going to say public class. So the name of the file is user view models, but the name of the class is going to be create model. Actually, create user model. This needs to have a few properties. So we need to have a username, an email, and a password. All three of these are going to be required. We want to make sure we put an error message in there. Add a display for that. So you can see from that, basically the plan is to create that create page. It's only going to have three fields on it: one for the username, one for the email, one for the password. Okay. So let's go back to our user controller, and we need to add some methods to support this creation process. So I'm going to go back to user controller. Close some of those tabs. So on the user controller, we already have an index method. I'm going to add in a create method. Of note here, do make sure that you keep that user manager property down at the bottom of the file, just to keep your code organized. So public action result, create, and I'm basically going off of pages 313 and 314 at the moment. So return view. Public action result. Create. This is the post version. And there I want to take in that create model. So create user model. Okay. So just as a refresher, what's that first thing we usually do when we're creating a user? What's line number 1? What's the first thing you should check? Huh?
If it's valid.
Check if the model state's valid, right? So I'm going to say if the model state is not valid, we're done. We want to get out of here. So if model state is valid, if it's not valid, then we're just going to return send you back to the page that you're on, or redisplay the page you're on. Okay. Otherwise, now I can start creating the user. Okay. So I want to create the actual user object. Remember, I've got a model object here, create user model. So to actually create it, add it to the database, I need it to be an app user object. Okay. So I'm going to create a new app user object here. Var user is equal to new app user. Now I do need to populate it with the values from the model. So I'm going to say username is equal to model.username, etc. Email is equal to model.email. Password hash. Password hash gets a little interesting. So I'm actually going to I'll actually leave that off because I need to do the encryption a little bit different. So you'll notice that on your user object you've got a password hash. That's the hashed password versus what we have from the model is the unencrypted password, right? That's the password the user has entered, but at this point it's completely plain text. Right? So the way that gets encrypted is part of the initial creation of the object. Okay. Now I do need to work with the user manager at this point, so I'm going to go ahead and grab it. So user manager is equal to user manager. And sometimes that's a little bit easier to write that as this dot user manager, simply for readability to say, okay, well, that's where I'm getting that from, is this dot username, user manager. Okay. I didn't do it yet, but I do need to change this method to be async, because what we're about to do will be asynchronous. So I'm going to change that to async task action result. Okay. Coming back down, I want to actually add the user. So I'm going to have, what I'm going to get back is an identity result. Result. Okay, is equal to await user manager dot create async.
Should we be using the variable in there? For the copy?
Oh, yes, we should be using that variable. So user manager create async user, and then model dot password. So when we create a user initially, when we want to create a user, we're going to call create user. If we want to give them a password initially, we actually pass that in here, and that's going to deal with hashing the password for us. So that what gets saved is the hashed password and not the plain text password. If we save the plain text password, we're not going to be able to log in because it'll expect it to already be hashed. Okay? Now, this result object that comes back does tell us something about whether or not the operation has succeeded. Probably a good thing to check. So in order to check that that actually went through, we're going to put a little if in here and say if the result dot succeeded, if it was successful, then we want to redirect the user back to the index page. So I'm going to say redirect to action. I'm going to redirect them back to the index action. Otherwise, we want to show an error. And return view model. So if the adding of the user does fail, we want to make sure that we show that error in a meaningful way to the user, right? Yes?
I don't know if y'all heard stuff downstairs.
Oh, I didn't.
The second time I heard a lot of babies and something upstairs.
Oh boy. Oh boy. So redirection actions. So if it's successfully created, we're going to redirect them back. Here you might want to set some temp data. So we might want to say temp data message as we're used to doing, and so that there's some indication of it actually was succeeded. So that way, if something if it does work, the user will get some indication about that. However, if it doesn't, if the user doesn't get created, we do need to show that to the user somehow. Okay. So if we look at the result, if you look at the result, you'll see there is a property called errors. Okay? Errors is a list of strings. That's what we want to be able to show to the user. Okay? Now the question is, how do we show that to the user on the form? How do we give the user that feedback? Okay.
I was going to say add model there.
Add model error. That's what I was looking for. Yeah.
And errors is an enumerable of strings, so you could probably use string builder and for each.
So I don't actually want to use a string builder because if I did string builder for each or string.join, that would put it all in one. I want to still keep them as separate errors so that they show up as separate errors on the front end. Does that make sense? So what I'm actually going to do is I'm going to do a for each over the errors. So for each string error in result dot errors. I'm going to add each of those errors to the model state. So model state, the add model error. We're going to add that with a key, I think it's blank if I remember right. Yeah, blank error. So remember this first part when we're adding model error, that's the key or the name of the field that has the error, but in this case we don't know which field has the error. So I'm just going to add that in as blank, and it's going to be in the validation summary. So if something does go wrong, it will show up in the validation summary. Okay. So that's the basic structure that I need for the creation part. Do you have any questions? It should look very similar to what we've done with the database already. The difference being we're dealing now with these user manager to actually create the users instead of directly adding them to the database.
And I can't remember if it was that create user model class that we're using.
Okay.
Where did we put that?
So I put it into a file called user view models into the models folder.
You made the class and the name. I got you.
So user view model is the name of the models is the name of the file.
Yep.
It'll have more than one model in here in a minute.
Right, I forgot. Yeah, you renamed that class. Okay.
Yeah. Okay. So we're going to create. Now that we've got the action methods in there, we're still missing the view, right? So I'm going to right click in here, say add view. I'm going to actually use a template here this time. We're going to change most of it, but I'm going to go ahead and start with the template because I'm creating a create user model.
This is going to be user.
Huh?
This is going to be user, right?
This will end up in the user folder. The way I'm doing this, remember I'm right click add view. This is actually a little bit faster than right clicking the folder if you right click it from here. So create user model, data context class, there we go. Actually, I think if I leave that blank, yeah, I just need to leave that fourth field blank. Okay, that'll create a basic scaffold of what we need there. Yep.
Did you select anything on the data context class? along with that?
No, leave the database, leave the data context as blank. So if you create that this way, it should give you a basic sort of starting point for the view. But we will need to change a few things, especially since it'll still be using Bootstrap 3 classes. So that should give you a page like this. And in fact, if I start using it, you'll see that some of the stuff already works. So username, it already gives me some checking and saying, hey, the password needs to be at least 6 characters. You'll notice it's not out of the box right now, though, checking things like email addresses to make sure that they're valid. So that's what we can get just out of the box, just what we call scaffolding a view. Okay, so let's go and change that, make that a little bit better. So I'm going to jump down to page, let's look at here. So we're on page, bottom of page 315. So bottom of page 315, I'm going to strip out a few things here to try and make it simpler. Actually, I'm going to just start from what's in that book. It's actually going to be closer. Ooh. So create user is my header. I have my validation summary. I'm going to move the validation summary into the actual, I'll leave it there. So validation summary. We've got a form group. We've got a label. That should be helpers.
So you switched it to what was in the book?
Huh?
You switched it to what was in the book?
I replaced it with what's in the book, but now I'm looking at it and like I'm gonna have to change a lot of stuff that's in the book too. So I'm just gonna read it off, write it off as I would usually, because I forgot there were some things in there that still needed to be changed. So we've got a text box for the username. We've got actually I'm gonna make that editor for the username. This is going to be new HTML attributes is equal to that. So I've got label for, editor for. I'm going to do the same thing with email. And then I've got the password. Button type submit, button primary. I'm going to put that in a form group like so. So this is BTN secondary. Yeah. The book has the cancel button as being BTN default, but remember that's something that's Bootstrap 3. So I'm going to change over to BTN secondary instead. So we've got BTN primary, BTN secondary. Now, the reason I'm using the editor for here, it's just a good practice, especially with some of the things that you get to when you're talking about editing and working users. It's very frequently that some data types change, as well as we need some more advanced, some of these more advanced attributes. So that's where I'm going to use the editor for there instead.
So we now have validation for like each one, we're just doing the validation summary.
Oh, you're right. I forgot that. Yeah, that'd be important. Validation message for. They didn't have that in the textbook, but yeah, no, we definitely want that. So validation for the username. New at class is equal to text danger. I also want a similar thing up here. Validation messages, our text danger. There we go. So validation messages for the username, the email, and the password. We definitely want to have those in there. What am I? Oh, attributes. I misspelled attributes. That's why. There we go. Okay. So this is what you should see if you have everything in correctly. Just by a show of hands, does anybody not have that at this point, or they're still typing? Okay. Yep.
I just have an error trying to figure out. So when I import this, it took me this identity, not that.
You mean add, you have packages from yesterday? Okay, if you would go back to the textbook, when you get
Turn on
those,
the packages
you
and
need
functional
posting
configuration. I guess put so the title and it's great one yet. It's like one thing is this is like the last 10% of my grade already. Switch 1, 2 to that. Hey Ben.
Have you seen validation measures?
Yeah, no. This was before.
Are you gonna put the text in there? Or what? Which one? No. Oh, first. So what do you have? In your computer, you make a what do you have? Like what's your
user just in general.
just in general? So you nice. Mobile responsive happen. I just have mine changing from Flutter to Chrome. I'm sure everyone got it. Copy paste quality. What was in the lab page? No, it used to be. It was. So basically, you have two separate ones. One that's like like that collapsed apart of the map bar that only shows when you hit that hot right button. And this one's displaying non-lit until it's moving. So it was eventually. It was kind of that. Yeah, but when you yeah, exactly. So yeah, it's not like something. To some extent, like worried about like changing the but it's fine. It's cool. Yeah, it's but the image is kind of weird. Like I mean, I guess you can't really tell from I guess like what was started compared to like 19 stuff. That the other day I just like felt like I got a pretty good copy. Yeah, like a rough version of that really detailed. Yeah, I mean it looks decent. And if I I'll save it. clean. Just show up
Okay. So we've got that crate page built. A few things we'll notice simply because we're using the editor for, we'd like it to change things like have this be an email entry. We'd like to have this be a password entry because right now it's just plain text. So to change those things, first of all, let's add in the autocompletes. So I'm going to add in here after class. I'm going to set this to autocomplete. And does anybody remember what you use for a username?
Is it just name?
That would be their full name. I'm going to look it up. Is it what? Check here. So search giant table.
Yeah, that was what a lot of them are.
A lot of them are weird. A lot of them are weird.
Is it username?
Yes. This one is username. So username. The next one is email.
You know what email is,
And the last one's the kind of important one. So remember, we're creating a user. So this needs to be new password as the autocomplete type. So our autocompletes are going to be username, email, and new password. Okay, that'll encourage the browser to put the right data into each of those. Okay, I also want to go to the view model itself, and we're going to add a few attributes. So first of all, to email, I want to add email address. Say, hey, this must be a valid email address. And to the password, oh, typo. That was password. That was password field.
Isn't it data type password?
Yeah. Also, I think for email, you also still have to include.
Oh, I'm thinking
data
hidden
type.
field. I'm thinking hidden field. That's what I'm thinking. Right, data type password. What were you saying?
I think you still need to include the data type attribute on email because
I think I do. Yeah.
the email address attribute just compares it to a regex. It doesn't tell
Right.
if it's an email address type.
Correct.
field.
I think you're right.
What speaks with the editor for, basically?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay.
Yeah, so as long as you have editor 4, it will consider the data type. But if it's just text box 4, it completely ignores that. So that's one of the reasons that we did all 3 of those as editor 4. So let's run that now. See if I get the right things. Okay. So on the create page, there, that's the page I'm trying to get to. So if I, there, yep, okay, that's what I want to expect. So if you inspect the 2 fields, what you should have now for the email should be type email, and in there you should also have autocomplete email for the username, you should have autocomplete as username, and the type should still be text. For the password, we have autocomplete new password, and we have type password. So that's what we should have now. That's keeping our ducks in order. All right, so I'm going to create a user. It's going to warn me that it needs to be a valid email address. And it's going to tell me that name Paul is already taken because there already is one I created. So admin. Okay. There we go. So you should have at least one or two users in there now. But now fortunately it's checking that those email addresses at least fit a good format, and we're also hiding the password as we type it in. So that's good.
I don't have any users showing up for some reason.
So go to your view, go to your index view. My guess is that you have a little bit of error in your code. So go to view. My guess is you're probably missing a not right there. Because we say any users. If there's any users, we want to show them. If there's not any users, we want to show the error message. So if you're not seeing any users, it's probably that you're just missing a not.
If you have like no users, or you do nothing,
Yeah. So that gets us to a point where we can now create users. We can view a list of the users. More often than not, though, you'll notice how we have the user ID. We usually don't show that. Usually there's not much value in showing that to the user, so I'm actually going to cut that out.
Do we want to like show the role once we get done there?
We will want to show the role. We'll add that column later, but I'm going to just remove the ID column completely. It also is probably worth it adding a little bit of margin to the bottom of that button, the create button. Little MB3 to push give us a little bit more space. Yes, Eston.
Okay, so when I type in the password, it doesn't like hide it. It just shows what I type in the password.
So did you add this attribute to your password? Data type password?
We can break this, isn't it?
Yep. Come back at 2:30. So we'll get back. We'll get on to editing users and deleting them, etc. Getting back to the textbook, so we're on page 316. The next thing it kind of asks you to do is go ahead and create a few users. I believe we've done that already, so they're going to run with this one user called Joe. You should be able to see if you try to create the same user again. You know, if the username is duplicate, it should give you an error saying, hey, that user's already taken. So it does do some checking there as far as verifying that you're not entering the same username twice. It doesn't do that for entering the same email twice, but it does do that for entering the same username twice. We may also want to put in some more logic for validating passwords. Okay, so there is an object that's built in called the password validator class. It already has a lot of checks that it can do. So a few of these, there's a lot of settings that we can change to change what those requirements are. So there's a required length. That's the minimum length that passwords need to be. You can also, there's also a Boolean to say whether or not it needs to have a non-letter or digit, in other words, a symbol or digit. There's another Boolean to say, hey, do you want to ensure that there's a digit? Do you want to ensure that there's a lowercase letter? Do you want to ensure there's an uppercase letter? So it's got a lot of basic checking that you can go ahead and use, and just by turning it off and on or changing the length of the minimum length of the password. Now, the way we use this password validator class is we're going to modify our user manager to bring this in. So I'm going to go back to the user manager. Under the create method on the user manager, we're going to add in some logic to set the password validator. So I say manager dot password validator. Is equal to new password validator. Then I can start setting these settings. So let's say I want the required length to be, passwords have to be at least 6 characters long. Require non-letter or digit, so that would be false. Require a digit is false. Require lowercase is true. Require uppercase is true. So simply by doing that, anytime you create a user or you change their password, they now have to follow these rules. They now have to have an uppercase character, a lowercase, and at least 6 characters.
How come we don't do this on the model instead?
Because the validator can actually do a lot more than what the attributes can do. So we can do some of this stuff on the model, but this actually works kind of at a lower level and allows us to do a lot more than just that. The other thing that happens is, depending on what you're backing, where you're storing your users, you don't actually have to store your users necessarily in an entity framework. It might be that you store your users in a completely separate database or in a completely different storage mechanism. That's not unusual. So you want to kind of be able to do that, and that's one of the things that having a password validator object like this allows us to do. It allows us to also have different storage mechanisms and still enforce those rules. Okay. So that's how we set up a basic password validator. If we now go to try and use it, go ahead and try to create a user, and we're going to give him a password of secret. So we've got Bob at example.com. I'm going to give him a password of secret. If I hit create, it's going to tell me passwords must have at least 1 uppercase letter. If I do all uppercase secret, it's going to tell me password must have at least 1 lowercase letter, etc., etc. So it gives me some indication as to what the rules are about passwords. If I just put in 1, 2, 3, it'll actually give me all 3 of those rules. So it gives the user some indication about what the rules are. One of the things I also get there that I don't necessarily get from using the model constraints is, hey, they've already customized the messages to be user-friendly. Does that make sense? at least more user-friendly than they would be by default. Okay, so that's where we're going to set that up. Okay, now looking a little bit further, we can also create subclasses of that password validator and add our own rules. Okay, so that's what I'm going to do here. So I'm going to create under the models folder, going to add a new class, and we're going to call this the custom password validator. Okay, so the custom password validator needs to be a subclass of the password validator. Okay. And in order to change how that password validator works, I need to overwrite the method that does the validation. So I'm going to say override validate async. Okay. So if you just type in override, you start typing the name of the method, you can just pick it and hit enter. It'll go ahead and fill in the signature for you. It's also nice in the sense that it's already going to go and call the base version. Okay, so by this token here, if I were to use this custom password validator, I've already got all the behavior that was already built in there. I've already got the minimum length, and I've already got those checks to see, hey, is it a valid password? Okay, does that make sense? So what I can do now is add in my own checks. So to do that, first I want to take the result that comes back from the base version and store it in a variable. So I'm going to say identity result is equal to await base.validate async. Oh, and this needs to be async. Okay. So basic structure there. Call the base version of validate, and then at the end, return that result. So far it's not doing anything different than what the basic password validator does. Okay. The reason I need to do that, the reason I need to have that variable in a result, is that way I can check A, to see if the base calculations are successful, but I also can then add in my errors to any error messages that it returned. Okay, so the special rules for this validator is I'm going to say that the password cannot contain the digits 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. So if it contains that, then it's not a good password. So we're going to say any password that contains that, not good. So if, and this should actually be pass up here. Rename that input. So if the password, if the password contains 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, then I'm going to add an additional error message to the list of error messages. Okay. So var errors, that's the new list of errors. I'm going to say result dot errors. So that's the current list of errors so far. If we will look at what result.errors is, it's currently IEnumerable of string, which actually we saw earlier. But I want to add an error to that. So I'm going to say result.errors. We're going to add something there. I'm going to use append, which is part of link. So I'm going to use link to add a new error message to it. I'm going to say passwords cannot contain numeric sequences. once I've created that list of errors, so that errors is take all the errors that are already there, add in my own error. Okay? So now I'm going to say result is equal to a new identity result, and I'm going to build that from that new list of errors. Now, the reason I have to create a new object there and not just say result.errors append is because the identity result object is what we call immutable. Okay? Anybody remember what immutable means? Maybe not. Okay. So immutable means that it's an object that we cannot change. I cannot change any properties on it, any data on it. Typically that means it has no setters. There's usually no setters. There's no manipulators on the data. That's valuable for a lot of things. In a lot of cases, you don't want your data to necessarily be mutated. So that's what we have here, which is why we're creating a new identity result. Does that make sense?
But at that point, isn't it not taking the base?
It's taking the base list of errors, right? Remember what append is. Append is a method in link, right? So this is not actually changing that original object. So result.errors gives us an IEnumerable of strings. Link methods work on anything that's enumerable. And remember, they typically give us an iterator. So this append method is actually just giving me an iterator. An iterator that will first iterate through all of the things that errors are already there, and then add the one at the end. So this actually doesn't create a list. That first line of code doesn't create a list, it doesn't create an array, it just creates an iterator. That iterator then gets run by the identity result object. Does that make sense? So it'll actually turn it into a list. But we just create an iterator. Pass that in. Okay. So I've got a custom password validator there. If I go back to my user manager, I can now use that custom password validator. Any guesses as to what I need to do to use it? Any suggestions there to now use the custom password validator?
When you're setting the manager.password validator, just
Uh-huh.
set it to a new custom password validator.
Just a new custom. Okay. So as easily as that, I've switched from the one that they gave me to a more advanced one where I can put whatever roles I want in there. So now instead of using the regular password validator, I'm using that custom password validator. Okay, let's try that out. If I create a new user now, run the program and create a new user, I should see that if I type in secret 12345, I can have that message. Passwords cannot contain numeric sequences. So it's going to block me from creating a user with any password that contains 12345, including 12345. Any questions there? You see where that might be pretty flexible as far as what you can do with that. There's a lot of things that we can do here, from doing rules like saying, hey, well, you can't use a password anybody else has, even. Things like that can even be done here. Or saying you can't have any of these top 10,000 most popular passwords, they're off limits. So we can eliminate all kinds of things like that to make our system more secure using a custom validator. Okay. There's also validators for the actual user objects. So we can create a validator for specifically passwords, but we can also create a validator that works with users as a whole. Okay. So in order to use a user validator, let's go back to the the user manager. So under the user manager, I'm going to add in a user validator. So we're going to say manager.user validator. And this is going to be a new user validator. It needs to know what kind of user we're validating. So it's going to be app user for us, because that's our subclass. And it also needs the manager object itself. So we're going to pass that down. Okay. Now there's two options that we can set. One that says you can only have alphanumeric usernames, which would eliminate any sort of Unicode characters, such as meaning you can't have emojis or Chinese characters or Arabic characters in your username, because right now you can put any character you want into your username. So if I put that in there, allow only alphanumeric, we're going to say true, and we're going to say that the email also has to be unique. So those are two of the validations that are already built in. I can easily just turn those on. I can say, hey, your usernames have to be only alphanumeric characters, and they have to be unique. Your emails have to be unique. Any questions? Can you see what's happening here? Let's do a quick test on that just to make sure that both of those things are working. So if I try to create a user, let's say their username, I put in a bunch of special symbols. And for the password, I'm just going to put in secret 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Okay. There. It says username, blah, 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 is invalid, can only contain letters or digits. So you can see it's only running the user validator if you have a valid password. Okay, so it's saying, hey, it can only have letters and digits. If I put my same username from earlier, Paul, it's going to tell me that that's already taken. Oh. I need a unique username. And that one's still, okay, that one didn't work. Anyway, so I can put those in there. If I want to add my own logic onto there, just like I can create a custom password validator, I can also create a custom user validator to validate some additional properties. So in order to do that, again, go back to models, we're going to add a custom user validator class. So custom user validator. Okay. User validator. Okay. And that needs to be app user. So our subclass of user validator, we only work with app users, and we have to now have a constructor. So public custom password validator app user manager. I give that a name, manager, call the base class manager. So we're creating a subclass of this user validator class.
Shouldn't it be custom user validator?
Yeah, it should. Custom user validator. There we go. Okay. Now to actually change the logic that is used there, I need to follow the same pattern that I did previously. So I'm going to override the validate async method. Okay. In the validate async method, I need to do the same kind of template where I grab the base class's result and then return it and do my own logic in between. So identity result is equal to await base.validate async. At the end of this, I return result. So again, I'm starting out this way because I want to keep any logic that's already been built to validate users. I want to just add in my own. Okay. So the logic that we're going to add in is we're going to say, well, every user that gets into the system needs to have an email that ends with example.com. Okay. You probably want to end up changing this once we get finished with this and you build your own project, because you probably don't want everybody on your website to end in example.com. So you can change that at will. But that's where we're going to start. So I'm going to say I want to check that the users are that way. So first, grab the user. Oh, this should again be, I need to change that to user. Okay. User.email. Now, how can I check that the email ends with example.com? Yep. Contains? Well, if I say contains, it would be anywhere, right?
You could use a regex.
I could use a regex.
You could just reverse it and just take the first however many characters example.com is and check.
It's much simpler than that. Much simpler than that. So if you look at the methods on a string, so there is a contains method. Contains is it anywhere. Thing is, I want to say, does it end with @example.com? Okay. So there's another method in here. You can see right there. It says starts with, which will say, does the string start with this sequence? By virtue of that, there's also one called ends with. So there's a starts with and there's an ends with. And those are things you need to remember. Contains does work when you don't care about where it is, but when you want to be more precise about it has to end with this or it has to start with this, you want to use that, especially because it's also more efficient. Ends with and starts with take a lot less work for it to do than contains. So ends with, we're going to say ends with example.com. example.com. Okay. And then if it does end, sorry. Okay. Yeah. So if it doesn't, we're forcing it, according to what we're doing here with the book, we're forcing it to have that end. On your end, maybe we want to do it the other way. Let's do it the other way. So we're going to say if the user ends with example.com, that's not allowed. So let's say var errors is equal to result.errors. We want to append the error message. And then result is equal to new identity result errors. So if the user has a password that has an email that ends with example.com, we're going to tell them, nope, you can't do that. Okay. Let's test this out. Let's see if this works. So one thing we need to, if you test it out, you'll see that you can still create users with example.com. One thing I forgot to do here, we still need to change this to be our custom user validator. So just like we had to change it to be custom password validator, we need to change it over to custom user validator. So if you have that in place, you should get something like this. If I put in a password that ends in example.com and I give it a good password, it should say, hey, example.com email addresses are not allowed. However, if I put it in like this, it will bypass that check, right? So we got to remember when we're doing contains, when we're doing ends with, frequently we have to make sure that we're doing this in a case insensitive matter. Okay? Yep.
I'm getting a syntax error. It says the non-generic, when I try replacing user validator with custom user validator, it says non-generic type custom user validator cannot be used with type arguments.
Because you didn't remove the app user part that was here. It needs to be just custom user validator.
Okay.
Because the one that we built doesn't, you see, it doesn't take a type argument.
Mm-hmm.
It's always app user. Whereas the base class, the user validator, you have to tell it what kind of user object are you validating.
Okay.
So our version doesn't need a type argument. The base one does. If we wanted to have our version take a type argument, it would look like this. We'd say custom user validator T and user validator T. So that's what it would look like if we were having our own be genericized, but we're not. Okay? Because we know this is only going to be used for our application, specifically to our application.
Mm-hmm.
Okay? So let's check, how can we check for it being case insensitive? Well, there's some other arguments that we can add to ends with that will change what kind of comparison happens. So if I add in ordinal ignore case, there it is. So comma, string comparison, ordinal ignore case, now we'll treat it in a case insensitive manner. So if it's all uppercase or all lowercase, it'll still.
Is the email?
Is it what?
Is it email string? The email?
Yes.
So why don't we just do it 2 lower there?
We could do it 2 lower. Remember, so 2 lower works just fine in English. 2 lower does not work so well in other languages. So usually avoid it wherever you can. This is a case where we can easily avoid it. If you look at what the textbook does, they do a 2 lower. Here I would just do an ignore case because it's possible. But yes, a 2 lower would work in this case as long as you're dealing with English, which we are.
So if you knew the string was an ASCII, you could use 2 lower.
Yeah, if you're an ASCII, at least 0 to 127 ASCII, you're okay. You're not okay in extended ASCII.
Well, because don't we have that limitation on special characters and different languages we work with ASCII?
Yeah, we did add that. So in theory, because we turned that into true, into true, we're saying those are rejected anyway if there's something other. Where is it? App user manager. Because we set this to true. Either if you're working with any of those other characters, you're not okay. Well, that being said, this is for usernames. We're working with emails.
Oh,
So
right.
an email still could have a special character in it.
Well, it kind of has to.
Yeah.
Anyway.
Yeah. So that's just general rule of thumb. It's just better wherever you can do it, to do it use the string, the case insensitive method instead of using the 2 lower if you can. That being said, emails, it's usually a good idea to go ahead and make them lowercase. Okay, so we've got some validation in there for our users. We've also got some custom validation in there for passwords. Okay. So looking at here, so page 13.9, you'd get an error message like that if it's not pass. Okay. Now, there's some more administrative features that we want to add to this. Namely, we want to add the ability to edit accounts as well as to delete accounts. Okay. So the way we're going to do that here is I'm going to add following along with what the book's doing, I'm going to add 2 buttons to our row. Okay, so going back to the user index view, first of all, remember this is our header row. So in that header row, I need to add an additional column to make space for action buttons. So I'm going to add in a header here. And call that actions. And then down on the bottom here, I'm going to add in some links or some forms to do those things. Okay. So first we're going to add in the edit button. So that's going to be at html.actionLink. That's going to go to the edit page. Sorry, the text of that link is going to be edit. It's going to go to the edit action. And we need to add in some route values so we know which user we're editing. So the way I'm going to do that, I'm going to say ID is equal to user.id. Okay. And I also want a way to delete the user. Okay. The way that it's set up with the book, it's not actually it's not using any sort of confirmation box, which is ideally we want to use. It's just using a form to submit that. Again, reminder: if I do anytime I want to change data, that needs to come through as a get or a post. Which of the two? Anytime I want to change data. These come as posts, remember? Because reading data should be the only thing I do in get. Get is for reading data. For changing data, I need to do a post. Okay. So if I want to have a delete button, it needs to be in a form. Because if it was just a link, it would be a get method. Okay. So I need that to be a post. So to do that, I'm going to add in a little form using HTML.begin form. This is going to go to the delete action. And I'm going to have a little hidden field in there, or well, route values. Okay, so delete user, so name of the controller, route values would be ID is equal to user.id.
Wait, there is a form method.
Huh?
This is the third parameter of the form method.
Yeah. So third parameter of the form method is route values.
So if we didn't have to set a form, would we have to use Ajax to perform the delete?
If you didn't what?
If we didn't want to use a form here, would we have to use Ajax?
You would need to use Ajax. I would still recommend using a form, again, as a fallback.
Okay.
Does that make sense?
Yeah.
So anytime you use Ajax, you always want there to be a fallback way of doing that that doesn't require Ajax. So if you put a form in there, that gives you the option of using that as your fallback.
Cool.
But an Ajax would be preferable. BTN danger, and this is going to be BTN small. Make that button small, so you're less likely to click on it. This is going to be type submit. And I also want to color the edit button. So as the fourth argument to the action link there, I'm going to add some logic to set the classes. So class is equal to BTN primary and BTN small.
We should also probably make the form inline.
Yeah.
You may want to. Yep, that's a very good likelihood. Let me just go try it just to see what it's going to do offhand. Yep. The other way to do it, which is how they do it in the textbook, is you can actually just take the link and put it inside. So if we take both of those links and we put them inside the form, that will do that will have that effect as well. That's another way around it.
So even having never mind, because the action link's not of type some. Okay, never mind.
Yeah. So if we put both of those in there, the thing is a form tag is normally a block. But these tags, both the action link, both the anchor tag as well as a button, are normally inline elements. So that way we've got two inline elements inside of a block. Yep.
Can I see the top of this file real quick for just a second?
So top of the file should be
That's all I need.
that. So you should have something like this now. So we've got an edit button, not doing anything yet, but we can see that the user ID is there. If I click on edit. If I click on delete, I can also see that the user ID is there, but again, it's not doing anything yet. Okay. So now that we've got a way to get to that functionality, now we can actually go back and implement it. Okay. So let's go back to the controller. And we're going to start adding in logic for the edit as well as the delete. Now, a reminder again, please make sure you keep the user manager down at the bottom of this file, just for organization purposes. So we're going to add another method for the edit page. So private action results. Actually, I think this is, yeah, they put the delete in there first. So we'll do the delete first. So action result, delete.
Wait, doesn't it need to be public?
Oh, yes, it does. It does need to be public.
And asynchronous probably.
Yes, it will need to be asynchronous. So asynchronous task there. We need to take the ID of the user we're going to delete. So I'm going to add a little delete in there, add a little ID in the parameters. Okay. And now I want to actually go about deleting the user. So first thing I need to do is actually get the user object from the database, or from the user manager really. So, well, let's grab the user manager first. User manager, because I'm going to need to use it for a few things, is equal to this dot user manager. Okay. Now I need the user. So the user, I'm going to get that from the manager. Await user manager dot find. Now there's a few different versions of find. There's synchronous versions as well as there asynchronous versions. You definitely want to prefer the async versions, but you'll see that there's a find async, a find by email async, find by ID, find by name. Okay, so at this point, what do we know about the user? Well, we know their ID, right? So what I'm going to do is find by ID async, because that's what I know. So find by ID, I'm going to pass in their user ID, and then hopefully I've gotten user out of there. Now it's possible that if you click on delete, that user may have already been deleted, right? So we do need to do a check to see, okay, is that user actually in the system or not, right? And if they're not, then we're done. Otherwise, we can keep on going with our work. So I'm going to say if user is equal to null, then we're going to return a view. This is going to be the error view. And as far as that error view is concerned, I'm going to give it an error message. So new string array. User not found. So the user doesn't exist. Show the user, show if that user we're trying to delete does not exist, then show the person that's using it just, hey, user not found. Yep.
I've been using temp data with danger alerts. Can I just do that instead of redirection to an error page?
That would be one way to do that as well.
Okay.
I would say that if you're going to use temp data there, you should have some way of indicating whether or not it's an error or whether it's success.
Yeah, I have two of them.
Okay. Yeah. So that would be one way to do you put it into temp data and then redirect. that would be fine. Again, using temp data should always be used with a redirect.
Right.
Okay, so that would be okay. If it is successful, we did find a user, that's the user that we want to then go delete. So just like most things, we're going to get an identity result back. So identity result is equal to await user manager dot delete async. So we're going to delete the user. Okay. Delete the user if it succeeded. If the results dot succeeded. If that's true, then we're all good. And we're going to redirect to the index page. And this would be a good place to indicate to the user again that something happened. So I might say user.username deleted to give the user some sort of indication about what just happened. Okay. Otherwise, I want to show the error view, but this time I'm going to use result.errors. Now, one thing you should realize in here, hopefully, is that I haven't created the error page yet. Right? So I'm using the error page here whether the users don't exist or whether there's an error in deleting them, but I haven't actually created that error page. Okay. So how should I go about creating that error page? I have kind of two options as to where I put it. I could put, as far as things go, I could put it into the user folder, put an error page under there, or I could put it under shared. Okay? So if I'm putting it under user, I'm basically saying that this error page is only used when we have errors working with users. Might be a good thing. More than likely, I'm probably going to want to use this error page in a few different places. Does that make sense? I'm probably going to want to use this error page in more places than just on the user controller. So I'm going to actually add this error page to the shared folder. Okay. So the model for this page is going to be IEnumerable. Yep.
That was in the user folder?
This is in the shared folder.
Okay.
So that I could potentially use it with more than one controller.
Does that actually make me a post, right?
It's what?
That actually needs to be a post, right?
Yes. Yes, we do need to denote that with HTTP post, because we only want it accessible through post. Okay. So we've got error. I'm going to loop through the errors and show those. So I'm going to add in a UL. At UL, I'm going to add in a little class text danger, so it all shows up in red. And then we're going to do a quick for each through all the errors. String error and model. Add an LI for each error, and we're going to show the error. That way, if anything does go wrong, we have a place, we have a page that can show those errors. And probably also want to make that header text standard. So now here's an important question. How can I make that error happen now? How can I make that happen where I get to this error page just to verify that it works?
You could set the user wait. You could throw an exception on the delete page.
Try to delete a user that's not there.
Try to delete a user that's not there. Okay. So the question is, how do I do that? It actually is a little bit easier to test if I just remove this for a minute and make sure I can get to it via delete. I mean via get request, because then I can actually just go there via typing things in. So if I type in user/delete/123, there shouldn't be user123. I should get a page like this. That make sense?
Got 404.
A 404? Did you remove the post?
I don't think I executed it.
Okay, that may be why. Let's just make sure that you can actually get that error page as well as you can actually delete it. So, we're missing the Owen file. So that put it at value should just be some. You successfully delete page?
For the test, will we need to have a confirm pop-up?
I would definitely like to add a confirm pop-up as far as that goes for the finished Validator project. But this is a good start. Okay, so we've got the delete. We want to do the edit next. Okay, so I'm going to mark this again. This should only be accessible really via post request because I don't want to allow the user to just type in a URL and delete somebody. So we're going to go back to that being just post. Okay. So now for the, where is this? Okay. Oh, they have a more complex, that's why. They have a more complex error page. There's something different going for the error page. Okay. On that error page, let's go ahead and, we do want to do that. So I'm going to add in an OK button. So at the end of this, I'm going to add HTML dot action link. Text of this button is going to be OK. Index and new null new brace at class. btn primary. So that'll just give them a way to get back. So should anything fail, that way they can get back to the previous page. Okay. So the edit. Let's go to user controller. So I'm going to actually put this above the delete, because that's usually where I usually do index, create, edit, and then delete. So we're going to add an action for the edit. Public async task action results and we edit. I'm going to have another copy of this that's going to be post. So one of these versions is used for post, one of these versions is used for get. Now, as far as being able to edit a user, I need to know which user you're editing. So I'm going to add a string ID parameter there. As far as editing a user, I'm going to allow the user to edit a few different things. So I need the ID to know which user you're editing. I'm going to allow you to edit your email or your password, or both. So those are the two things that the user can edit on the edit page, is the email or the password. It's likely that you may want to add more things to that, but that's going to be a good starting point. Okay. So similar to the delete, when I get in here to edit a user, I need to grab the user manager, and then I need to try and grab the user, because I need to show the information that's already on the user object. And then I'm going to say if the user object does exist, or sorry, if there is no user, similar to what we had earlier, I'm going to give the user an error message. So again, if there is no user with that ID, we're going to show the error page of user not found. If the user does exist, then I'm going to say return return view error. View model. User. Yep.
Is there a reason why you don't make the user manager global instead of being local? Is this reason?
Because timing. So if I made it, let's think about what you mean by global, because global means something specific. Do you mean a member variable or do you mean an actual global?
A member variable.
Member variable.
Being accessed outside.
Okay. So let's say I make it a member variable, right? Which would mean I put it up at the top of this file, right? If I make it a member variable, then what I'm saying is we'll grab this. We'll grab this at the beginning, but it also then assumes that you want it for everything, right? So it makes the assumption that every action is going to use it. May or may not be true. May or may not be true. It is likely, at least as far as this controller is concerned, that probably every action will use it. But a lot of times your controllers, you may use it only in one place. So that way you only have to use it when you need it. That makes sense. If I made it really, to make it a global variable, remember, I would need to put it up to the top and mark it static.
Yeah.
That would be really bad. That would be an actual global variable, because that would mean but that means there's only one instance of it everywhere,
Yeah.
which is a problem, especially given that I'm supposed to have a different instance for every request. So I don't want to do that. Okay, so this is the version that we're going to get for get, that we're going to use for get. So if the user exists, it does not exist, we're going to say user not found. If the user does exist, then we're going to present them with the edit page. Okay. If once they go post that user, I need to do a very similar thing. I need the user manager, and then I need the user. Okay. So if you're going to edit the user, I still need to know the user object. Okay. Now, I do want to check if the models, I do want to check if what you've given me is valid or invalid. So first thing I'm going to do here, I'm going to say, well, if the user doesn't exist, again, just show them user not found. Okay. Assuming they do exist, then we're going to start changing some of their properties. Okay, so first of all, I'm going to say user.email is equal to the email that they set. Okay, then I want to immediately check whether or not that email is valid. Okay, how can I check whether or not that email is valid? What?
Don't we have the user validator?
Have the user validator. Okay, so I'm going to use the user validator to determine whether or not it's valid. Okay, so I'm going to create an identity result here. We're going to call this valid email. This is going to be equal to await user manager dot password, or no, user validator dot user validator dot validate async, and there I'm going to give it the user.
Do we want to use our custom user validator then?
That will use the custom user validator. Remember where we set it? We set manager.userValidator was equal to this.
Oh, right.
That is our custom validator. So if I'm using the standard validator, that will be the standard validator. If I'm using a custom validator, that will be our custom validator. So this is that.
So whenever we call that property user manager, it goes to that create method in the user method.
Well,
user
it
manager
only
object?
does that once per request.
Okay.
Remember? So with the way I've set up things in startup, remember I've told it create per row in context. So every request we get in, we get no in context, and we get this user manager object.
Okay.
So that's every time the user asks for a page, we're going to create a new user manager. Once I'm looking at that user manager object, there it is. So that user manager, we've already set them up with our password validator and our user validator. So those things are accessible past this point. Once it's been created, we just do manager.passwordValidator, manager.userValidator. So that's what we're using here. We're using the validator we set up previously. So if I say valid email, I need to then check if it is valid. So I'm going to say if valid email, if we haven't succeeded, if not succeeded, then we're going to add those errors to the result. Okay. Now, one thing that I may want to follow up and do, there are a few places like this where we are going to see the same block of code. So, for instance, here I want to add all the errors that are in the valid email object to the list of errors that the user is seeing. Okay. If you remember when we wrote the create method, remember we have this logic here. Loop through the errors in the result and add all of them to the model. We're going to use that quite a bit. There's a few places here, plus a few places in the edit where we need that. So oftentimes it's worth going ahead and making a quick method that can do that, which is where I'm going to take this logic here and I'm actually going to move it into a method. So down at the bottom of the file, down at the bottom of the user controller, I'm going to add a private method, and we're going to call this add errors from result. It's going to take an identity result object. We're going to put that code in there and say, oh, this needs to be void. So it's going to add all of the errors that are in the result to the model state. And I'm going to change the code up here in the create to call that. So add errors from result, and we're going to pass in the result object. That's going to reduce the amount of code duplication that we have when we're trying to show errors. So I'm going to do that in the crate. I can also now do that down here after we've checked that the email is valid. And there I'm going to pass in the valid email object. Okay. So I've checked that the email is valid. I also want to check that the password that they've given me is valid. Now, it's possible that they still want to keep the same password, right? It's possible that they may not want to change their password. Now, remember from what we talked about yesterday, I don't know their actual password, right? So I can't just pre-populate that field on the form with their current password, right? So what that means is if they want to keep their password, we're going to leave that field blank. Does that make sense? Because I don't know what their current password is, I have to say, well, if you leave it blank, we're going to assume that you mean to keep it the same. So I'm going to say if string dot is null or white space, if their password, and actually I want that to be not, if it's not null or white space, then I know that what you've typed in is actually a good password, and we're gonna validate it and treat it as something besides just gobbledygook. I mean, besides just being empty. So there, I'm gonna say identity result valid pass is equal to await, similar to what we did with validating the user. I'm going to say user manager dot password validator dot validate async, and I'm going to pass in the password. So if they give me a password, I'm going to check that it's valid, but I'm not going to check that it's valid or do anything with it if they don't provide me with one. Okay? So if that password is valid, if valid pass dot succeeded, then I need to update their password, right? So I want to set user dot password hash to something. Now remember that password here needs to be hashed. Okay. What I have right now is a plain text password. Okay. So similar to what we've done already, again, there's a password hasher object, and can you guess where it is? It's on the user manager. So if I go to, again, the user manager, dot password hasher, hash password. Again, if we needed special hashing logic or we wanted to use a better hashing algorithm, we can build our own custom password hasher. But we're going to use the default one for our purposes here. And in fact, this code would not have to change, just would not have to change if we used a custom password hasher, just like the other code doesn't need to change. Okay, so user password hasher is able to hash password, and then in the case where it didn't succeed, where it's an invalid password, that's where I need to add the errors again. Add errors from results. So we're going to show that to the user. What should be valid pass? So if they do provide me with a password, we want to check that it's valid, and then we also, if it is valid, then we need to hash that password. Yep.
Now's a good time for a break.
Almost. Let's finish up this method before we break, because we're almost done here. So we've given the user an option to change the email. We've given the user an option to change the password. We checked both of those things are good. And if they're both good, we'll have now changed those properties. User.email will have changed, and user password hash will have changed. So if that's all good, which the way I can check that it's all good is again looking at model state. So if model state, if it's valid, then we can save it. Otherwise, we're going to show the form to the user again. So if it's not valid, I'm going to just say return view user. But if it is valid, then I'm going to go ahead and save that. So there I need an identity result again. So identity result saved is equal to await user manager dot update async. So we're going to update the user, and then if that succeeds, we're all done. So saved dot succeeded. Then we can return, whether we can redirect them to the index page. And I might want to do some stuff with temp data there. Make sure I'm using the same logic. So temp data message, I might say user.username, updated. And if it didn't succeed, if we didn't succeed at saving it, then we're going to add the errors and show the view again. So we're going to add saved dot or saved, and then return view user. If you've got all that logic in, go ahead and take a break, and we'll come back at 4 o'clock.
So it doesn't matter that user.email, you set that before all the validation. It doesn't want to send the result again, or was that?
That's good. So what that means is, so I said user.email equals this.
Right.
So that means that it's all that I want to change. If everything goes through, that means the email will be the same. If it doesn't go through, that still means the email will be the thing that shows up in the page.
Oh, okay.
It means that email that I
So
type
we need to
in.
get back to them if it shows back up there.
Yeah.
Okay.
If I read this, if it's invalid, that's still going to be the email that they see. If they want to type.
So it doesn't have to disappear. Okay. Right.
Password's a little bit different, but it's going to be, it should be cleared out either way.
Right.
What goes in the for each and the add error to result? What's that part?
See what you have.
The string error and
You're going to say add monostate. Or sorry, monostate to add error. Add one error. And the first argument to that is an empty string, and then it's the error.
the ER.
Yep, that's it. So if you go back,
I think I fixed that one.
okay. Because we originally had the code here
Yeah.
for that, and that's basically what we did.
So it was the same code.
That was, this is the same code that was there. We're just making sure that we don't have to put it.
Same code over and over.
So.
They're not gonna fire us off of this, because they use someone that they so while they fire their code. That's crazy. If they have to put that rule real quick, I don't know what this rule.
Alright, so we've got the back end put in place. We really need to put in the view for this, and then we should be done with the edit page. And I think that finishes up with most of the main administrative stuff. So if we right click in here, I'm going to say add view. We're going to add the edit view. I'm just not going to use a template for this. And I'll bring in the code from bottom of page 330. So bottom,
User?
huh?
This is on the user.
This is on the user. So auth example models. Okay. We've got the. Let me check real quick. I've got the crate page. Actually, just going to borrow the logic that I've already built for the crate for some of the edit logic. So we're going to edit user, so edit page, and what's going to change here? We have app user, label for, oh, okay. So when it comes when it comes to the username, I'm just going to have a hidden field, so they can't change their username. So I don't need that, but I do need to know their ID. So I do need to add a hidden field for the user ID. Okay, so we're going to add a hidden field for the ID. Oh. Yeah, this is the edit user model. I am going to put in a place. I'm going to put in an input tag for, or sorry, a tag for the username. So HTML dot display for x dot username. And then I'm going to give this a class. And I think that's still there. So form control static, so you can see the username, but you can't change it. For the password, I need to actually do that part in HTML, or at least in the helpers. So if I do label password, and this is going to be just password. Yeah.
validation message for
Mhm.
username? You get email there?
Oh, yep.
That be-
That still needs to be username.
Do we even need validation though? For username?
More than likely, probably not. That's just a fallback in case something were to go wrong.
Okay.
It's a good rule if you have a field to always, to try and put a validation message there for it. Just so there's a place to put an error message if one would need to be put, even if there's not necessarily a foreseeable way that there would be one. Because the cost of putting one there when there's no error message is relatively minor versus the cost of not knowing about an error message that's happening is pretty high. So that's basically it. The important part is that hidden for. Absolutely make sure you have a hidden for the user ID. And then we've got display for the username, editor for the email. And I've switched over here on the password. I'm using label and password instead of using label for and password for, because there's no just regular password field on the actual model. That makes sense. So password for, label for are used when you have a column. Label password is just used when you don't have that column. And this would be save. Would be the name of the submit button. Not create, because we're not creating anymore.
So is it possible to change this display on username? Because it's coming from the app user
Okay.
model. Like, I feel like in most websites, username N is lowercase. Is app user something that we made, or was that built in?
So you're saying username is what is lowercase?
I feel like typically the N in username is lowercase when you're right, and it's displaying uppercase.
It really depends. So sometimes username is treated as one word, which is where if you treat username as one word, the N would be lowercase. If you're treating username as two words,
right,
then you have an uppercase. That username column is part of the identity framework. It's
Okay, so
already on there on the identity user object.
so we cannot.
You can't change the name of it.
Okay.
It has to be user, uppercase N, name. That's already baked in.
Yeah.
There's a lot of things you can change. That's one of those that they've already decided the name of the variable, the name of the property, because they needed to have that be in there. So if I go to editor user now, you should see something like this, although that's not exactly what I was hoping to get. I might need to change this to just form control. I know there's a version that's static, but I forget. Bootstrap 4, form control static. What did that get replaced with? Form control plain text, maybe? No, that's not the one. So I remember that they removed static fields. Oh, it might still need to be might still need to be it might still need to be a text box.
Can you just make it disabled?
Oh, that's what it is. Okay. All right, it's not styling it the way I thought it would. Yeah, we could. Let's do form control. So form control plain text. It's the one that they're recommending there. So plain text does work. What it ends up doing is it ends up putting it down on a line, like there, and you only get the border if you click on it. Although it does need to be marked read only. So read only is equal to true. And that needs to be at read only, because that's a keyword. There we go. So if we make a text box for read only, form control plain text, that would do it. If we did it as just form control is going to change it from looking like so to like so. Yeah, that's probably better. So form control and setting it to read only is probably the better way to switch that over. So if I hit save without changing anything, it should work here. If I go and edit this user, I'm going to get an error that the email's not valid. So I can change the email. It's going to tell me that it's already taken. So I can change the email that way. I can also go change the password. By filling that in, and that will do it that way. Okay. So we've got the ability to do all of the CRUD operations there. We can create users, we can edit them, we can delete them, and we can look at all the users that are in the system. Okay. One common thing we'll want to do in here, you may notice that these users are not necessarily in a particular order. So anytime you have a list of users, it's usually good to go ahead and sort them one way or another. So if we just say users.order by here in the index page, we may want to order them by their username. That at least get us a sensible sort of ordering to where they are. Okay.
It should be,
Huh?
it should be user slash edit, right?
User slash what?
Just need to recall it. No.
So that's the basic setup there. And that's really the end of chapter 13. So that's where chapter 13 ends with the edit functionality. And so far as what we've looked at so far, as far as what we looked at there, so we looked at, again, all the CRUD. The next thing we want to kind of look at in chapter 14, one of the big things that's in there is actually dealing with roles, also dealing with logins, because we've created these users, but we still can't log in as those users. That makes sense. And we also, as far as this is concerned, anybody can mess with the user data right now. We haven't locked that down so that only an admin can get to this functionality. So that's another thing that we need to do. Okay. So going into chapter 14, that's definitely what we want to do tomorrow. I think given the time, I'll probably just put that off, push that back to tomorrow so you can continue with your projects today for the remaining few minutes that we have. But that's the plan then for tomorrow, is we'll go through authentication and managing roles. Any questions that are outstanding with what we've covered so far?
Can you see your edit again for a second?
Yep. Do you want the view, or do you want? Okay, edit.